Good evening. My name is Chris Allen. I'm General Manager of KVNO, Classical 90.7 FM, your classical music station in Omaha. And I want to welcome you to the Omaha Symphony Orchestra pre-concert discussion prior to tomorrow night's chamber concert performance. The symphony will be performing three numbers tomorrow night, an octet for a strange combination of instruments, a little bit. A contemporary piece, or fairly contemporary piece, called the Strum for String Quartet, and a Stravinsky piece that sounds absolutely fascinating. My guests tonight are Ann Nagoski, a violinist with the symphony, Nate Olson from the bass section, and percussionist Derek Dreyer. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
It's great to have you. So let's talk about, first of all, this piece by Jean-René Francais, a piece called Octet for Clarinet, Bassoon, I'm forgetting something here, and violin quintet. Horn and violin and violin quintet. So clarinet, horn, bassoon, and the violin quintet. An unusual combination. And what is it like to play that combination?
You're right, it is an unusual combination, but it does have a parallel with another famous octet by Schubert. So it's actually a string quintet, two violins, viola, cello, and double bass, and then the winds that you mentioned. I think the biggest challenge for us performing is that it's tricky to get the balance correct between the different instruments. Wind players tend to be, in general, much louder than string players. So we have to kind of account for that and accommodate that as we're playing and find a good blend so that everyone can be heard.
When you first approach it, what's the process of finding that balance? How do I mean, none of you is a wind player, but what's the adjustment like? What's the process of learning?
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's interesting. It's a process that's made even a little more difficult by all of our COVID protocols we have in place. We're actually spaced out 6 feet apart from everybody, so it makes it that much harder. But it's definitely, I would say it's a trial and error process. It depends on the space we're playing in. And this will be interesting. So we've had 2 days of rehearsal now in one space, which is in the recital hall in the Holland Center, where Derek is right now, actually. And then our performance will be on the main stage in the hall there. So we'll have a bit of an adjustment period tomorrow in the dress rehearsal. But yeah, definitely trial and error, and having other people in the space with you that can give you feedback on how it's blending and what is going out into the space.
So Francais has been criticized that his pieces are perceived as being light or I don't know, easy. Music was never particularly easy to me, but that's the criticism that has been leveled. And I'm curious, Ann and Nate both, is it true in this case? Is this a relatively simple piece to perform?
I don't think so. It's a fairly big piece, and for me it was very unfamiliar. I'm not sure if my colleagues had played it before, but I had never heard this piece before being asked to do it now. I think sorry, I just lost my train of thought here. In terms of difficulty, it is fitting together a lot more easily than I expected it would. But each of our own parts has things about it that are particularly challenging, sometimes almost absurdly challenging. And we've been sort of joking about those spots. The cellist in our group this morning said that the interesting thing about this piece is that each part individually sounds completely strange and foreign and has all these very odd things about it. But when you fit all the 8 parts together, it comes out very charming and light and cute. But there's a quote that somebody shared with me, and I'm sure I will not get it exactly, but Francais apparently said that people told him his works were too easy. And he said, whoever said that has obviously not played them.
Or perhaps played them correctly. Nate, what are your feelings about it? What's been your process in preparing this piece for performance?
I would agree with Anne. Individually, I guess I would agree in some sense that there aren't, hard licks, that like we like to call them. There's nothing that required a tremendous amount of like individual practice to work out every fine detail. But getting into the group and kind of learning the way it's all integrated, you really have to know what everybody else has and how it fits in with your part. To make it all fit together. And that's been the most challenging part for me.
Ryan, so we could go back to what we first talked about, learning the balance has got to be part of that challenge.
Definitely.
What's the highlight of this piece? What should people listen for? What are we expecting out of this?
Do you want to start, Anne? Or I can start.
Go ahead.
I really like all four movements. It's a lot of fun. The two movements in three, the waltz and the scherzo, are a lot of fun to play. I suppose if I had to pick my favorite movement, I would go with the third movement. I think it's kind of just this beautiful kind of slow. It makes you feel, very, very comfortable, warm, embracing. Starts off with the strings, and then it gets passed off to the woodwinds, and then it kind of seems like Francais had this epiphany of, oh, they could both do this at the same time, and then we come together for the second half of the third movement, and it's just a beautiful movement.
I agree. I think my favorite is probably the final movement, which takes the form of a Viennese waltz, but kind of a contemporary slant on a Viennese waltz. It was written for a group in Vienna originally in 1972 that needed another piece to complement the Schubert octet that I was referring to earlier. And that's why it was written for this particular group of people. And the first violinist of that octet was the concertmaster at the time of the Vienna Philharmonic and the leader of the group that played waltzes on New Year's Eve every year. And I think Francais put in this little waltz as kind of a tribute to him and to this orchestra. So that's kind of my favorite. It's like a Viennese waltz after you've celebrated a bit too much on New Year's Eve.
Yes.
That sounds like fun. It sounds like a lot of fun. The second piece is a piece by Jessie Montgomery, another 20th century composer. It's called Strum for String Quartet. So, Anne, I'm going to start with you. The first thing I want to ask is because this is really the second piece this season by Jessie Montgomery that the orchestra is performing. You performed Starburst in October. How does this compare to Starburst? What are the similarities and differences? I'll start with you, Anne, and then Nate.
I think I'm new to Jessie Montgomery's music, but I love it. She is just an incredible young composer that has really been making a huge impact, I think, in American music lately. So I'm kind of excited to get to know more of her works. What I've noticed about both of them, though, is that they're very expressive. She uses a lot of techniques and can sort of portray things in music without telling an actual story. She can portray just concepts and ideas and visual images very, very strongly. And I find that to be one of the most kind of striking and exciting things about listening to her music.
Yeah, and I said 20th, and I should have said 20th, 21st century composer. Nate, what do you find about this?
I would agree with Anne. Kind of piggybacking off of that, kind of the first thing that stands out to me about her music is if you look at the title and then you listen to the piece, you kind of know what to expect. You have a sense of what to expect just from reading the title. It's very literal and plants a lot of visual images, and it all comes out in the music really literally. But with Strum, I had a chance to listen to that the other day, and I mean, it is what you would expect. A lot of strumming, kind of almost guitar-like in a sense. But then in Starburst is just like, it's very bright and kind of all of these kind of flashing, bright sounds coming from different parts of the orchestra, and almost like you're staring up at the stars. So that was the first thing that stood out to me. And then the other thing was they had a similar energy, just a very uplifting energy. Like it was like you almost didn't want to sit down while you were listening to it. Just like a contagious energy in both pieces, I would say.
So let's talk about this title. It's simply called Strum, and I assume, Anne, there's a reason that it's called Strum.
Sure is.
Explain that for us.
I'd be happy to. I find that it's very hard to talk about this piece without explaining a little bit of the strum concept. So on string instruments, we can use a bow, but we can also do something called pizzicato, or we sometimes just call it pizz for short, which is an Italian word that means that we pluck our strings this way. And there's actually a lot of variety of ways we can do that. And it's kind of, I think, what drives this piece. There's a lot of rhythmic action in this piece that is done by pizzicato throughout in different ways. And I would say that the pizzicato is almost like having a percussionist in the group, but we pass along that responsibility. I'm playing second violin on that particular piece, and that responsibility falls to me a good chunk of this piece. But I wanted to demonstrate a few of the different types of strumming. So the piece is about, I think, maybe 8 or 9 minutes long, and it begins very calmly. It's almost wistful or sort of reminiscent. And I've got an instruction in my music at the beginning that says that I should pluck the strings guitar style. By the way, just my image is reversed. So I do not hold my violin in my right hand. It just looks like I am. I hold it the way everyone else does. It's very disarming to me to look at it this way. So in any case, the beginning, I start off strumming very quietly like this. And that's kind of the first mood that we set. But it very quickly starts picking up in energy. And the second version is a very driving rhythm that repeats over and over again. And there's some very lyrical things going on above that in the other instruments. But my part sounds, I don't know, almost like I said, almost like a drum. And onward like that. And then it gets faster and faster and more energetic and more breathless. And finally, towards the very end, I have an even faster part that sounds like this. And then we go hurtling to the conclusion.
Well, the first way you played it sounded a little like a ukulele.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was interesting. But so I know string players on their left hand develop calluses from pressing the strings, and I know guitar players do if they pick with their fingers instead of a pick. Many of them will use picks on their fingers. You're obviously not allowed to do this because it's hard to switch back to the bow. So you don't have calluses on your playing fingers, do you?
I do now.
Well, you may now.
Actually, it's more of a blister. We were comparing our strum injuries at rehearsal today. It should recover in a few days.
Ow! Ow! It just sounds painful. Ow! So Nate, do you have to do this too? Are you subject to this strumming?
No, so I'm actually not on that piece. So that's just a string quartet.
Oh, you're not on it. Okay.
Violin, viola, cello. Yeah. But we do, bass players do develop calluses on their pitzing hand also, mainly jazz players. And
Yeah.
We've got a couple of those in the section that play a lot of jazz, so they always have calluses built up, and I don't do as much of that. So anytime we get to a pop show or a show that requires a lot of pitzing, I'm always joking with one of them that I develop blisters every time, and then I have a callus, and then just enough time goes by before the next one where the callus is gone, I get blisters again. So kind of funny.
My favorite pizzicato section is the third movement of the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony. There's a whole pizzicato section in, I think it's the third movement, and it's always just been fascinating to me. This is adapted from a string piece for orchestra. So how does the smaller quartet give as much life to this as a larger instrumentation normally would?
I think what we lack in volume that you would have with a large group, we can make up for with ensemble and just kind of the closeness of the group and the ability to really fit together in a very tight way. I don't know, I feel like the energy is just as high, but we don't have to worry about keeping all the members of a section together. We are one per part, and so we can just kind of act as much in unison as we possibly can. And that can be actually almost more exciting because the energy is very palpable.
But again, because of COVID protocols, you're more separated than you normally
Correct.
would be. You would normally be a very small arc of performers, and now you're more separated, and that, I would assume, has caused some adjustments to be made.
Yeah, just as Nate was saying with the octet, normally in chamber music, we try to sit as close together as possible because we want to be able to hear everyone very clearly. And that has been kind of the challenge with putting together both of these pieces. And I'm sure the Stravinsky as well, is just that we are used to being able to hear things a little better, and we have to trust our colleagues a little more and adapt accordingly and just know everybody's part that much more because we can't always hear everything. And visual contacts also, I'm discovering a little bit more difficult because you can't just lift your eyes up out of the music. You really have to turn physically to see someone if you wish to kind of cue them or signal something to them.
Would you like to see the symphony or the chamber play more of this composer?
I would. I'm really enjoying her a lot. Yeah.
Yes.
Good answer.
Yes.
What he said.
What he said. I want to turn to the Stravinsky piece. There's actually a lot in this that I want to talk about. And Nate and Derek, you perform on this piece. This is, to me, and I haven't heard this piece, so I was reading about it before the program. It's the age-old tale of making a deal with the devil, isn't it? I mean, Stravinsky has picked up on a theme that sort of runs through literature and well into music up until contemporary days. It's a not a particularly happy tale.
It isn't. No. I don't know, Derek might be able to speak a little bit more to this, but he kind of picks one instrument to portray the devil, and then the violin kind of goes back and forth as it changes hands in the story. At some points it's the devil's violin, and at some points it's the soldier's violin. Right. And then the other instruments, they kind of play, they kind of help make settings. I have several repeated figures kind of that run throughout the piece. But in the first movement, the march, I essentially play the same thing over and over again for the entire movement while all of the meters change underneath and everything. But it is the march, just dum, 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 just over and over. And then in the second movement, it's I have a repeated figure bum beam bum 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 beam bum bum that kind of continues on and on. But that kind of to me more portrays that scene is supposed to set next to a river, and so it's kind of the river that's there while the rest of that scene is happening. But yeah, maybe Derek could go on a little bit more about how the percussion fits into that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's true. The instruments at different times in the piece kind of evoke different images and different characters. So it's not necessarily consistent from the beginning to the end, but the very end of the piece is a drum solo that we won't ruin the surprise. You can read about it and understand what happens there. But it's a pretty dramatic finish, and at that point in the show, it's pretty clear what I'm representing, and understanding that there's a story to it helps inform how we play the music.
So you both brought up something that I want to probe a little bit, because I was reading about this a couple of days ago, and the passage that I was reading about it said that that Stravinsky just threw in all sorts of time changes. And for that reason, it is often performed with a conductor. You are choosing not to have a conductor. How challenging is that? Derek, I'll start with you.
Sure. So there's a good story about this, that in one of the early recording sessions they were doing with Stravinsky conducting, they were having a hard time playing because he himself was having a hard time conducting the piece. And so they take a lunch break, and Stravinsky leaves the room and the musicians stay, and they record the piece on their own. And that's the version that ended up being on the album. So in a way, a conductor can be more of a problem than a help in a piece like this. But at the same time, we have to, without that kind of lifesaver there to help us, guide us, we really have to trust each other and really listen to each other. The example that Nate brought up, he plays a repetitive marching figure in that first movement. And that sometimes is on the beat and sometimes it's off. So you hear that in a way where you always want to hear it on the beat. And so it kind of messes with your expectations. And I think from a musician standpoint and as a listener standpoint, that can be a good thing if you embrace what it creates, which is an inability to fully connect to it. And so then you just kind of sit back and take it all in. I think that's part of the great effect of the piece.
Nate, what challenge does this make for you?
Well, so this is my first time performing this piece. So I've only experienced it without a conductor, but I could definitely see how in some instances I think it could be helpful to have a conductor up there, clearly marking, the meter changes and the beat. But then at the same time, there's already a good group of us, and it kind of just puts another person out there that, if they make a mistake, especially being a conductor, that would throw everything off. And all of the meter changes, you go from 3/8 or 5/8, 7/8, where you're just counting eighth notes, and then you have to switch to 16th notes, and it just gets very complicated. And if something were to go awry, especially from the conductor position, it would probably be a total train wreck. So
and I think the musicians kind of interact in a unique way too without the conductor. And so sometimes when there is somebody there, you might shut out your neighbor and you're just going, this is the guy that I'm going with. And without that, you really have to listen a lot more and be involved in a more direct and intimate way with the people that you're playing with. I think it just changes the way the ensemble plays.
Exactly the question I was going to get to, so I want to follow up on that for just a moment. I also want to invite anybody who's watching this to, if you have a question, please drop us a line. You can write your question and we'll get it answered here. So my follow-up question is exactly that, Derek. It is, and Nate, both. You really have to have not just the oral, the audio contact with each other, but really, do you find yourself with an even more heightened visual contact with each other and giving each other visual cues?
Yeah, definitely. And then in rehearsal, these last couple of days, I don't know if you've noticed this, Nate, and been irritated by it, but I'll be doing this kind of thing here in these kind of gestures.
It's very
mostly
helpful.
Okay, good. It's mostly for myself, but that's the idea that we have to be looking at each other, and the violinist and I obviously, and we could talk about this a little more in a bit, but there's a couple of movements in there that are just kind of her and I interacting, and so there's definitely that visual context. And in the larger sense, we had a concert earlier this year that, based on these protocols that we mentioned earlier with COVID related, it was brass and percussion, and the brass is all situated up in the choir seats in the Holland, and then it was just two percussionists down on the stage by ourselves so it's like conductor, the two of us, and then brass, and we literally couldn't see them at all. So that was a really unique kind of component, and that made me think of that visual thing, is that I just had to trust that what I was seeing and what I was playing was going to align with what they were seeing too from the conductor.
Yeah, I would add, if you were to go on YouTube and look at different recordings of the piece, and if they have video, for every recording you listen to, you would probably see a different arrangement of how the musicians set up, and that's something that we've been playing with this week. We've probably changed like twice since we've started already, but with the COVID protocols, we've kind of ended up in a big arc so that we all kind of feel included, but the downside to that is you kind of, to see the person to your right, you got to look that way. To see the person to the left, you got to look that way, and your music is in front of you. And with a piece as complicated as this, with meter change after meter change, it's almost like you have to be glued onto your part so you don't make a mistake. And so it makes seeing out of your periphery pretty difficult.
Yeah, and I got to the first rehearsal, and it was my percussion setup was already set, and I expected to get there and see half the musicians on one side and half on the other, and instead they set up all directly in front of me, completely blocking me out of this circle. I'm like, come on, guys, can I be a part of this? So yeah, we made that adjustment eventually, but I think they're too used to keeping the percussion in the back out of their sight.
So we do have a question, and it's actually a pretty good one from Jim, asking if any of you can speak to what the musical influences were on Stravinsky while he was writing this piece. Any of you delved into the piece enough to know what Stravinsky was thinking when he wrote it?
So I think there's a couple of different factors here, and one being the time that it was written in 1918, the World War that was going on created a certain requirement for a smaller ensemble. And then also I believe that he was given a stack of sheet music that was ragtime music, or like very early Dixieland kind of jazz music. And there's some discrepancies as to whether he himself had heard the music before or not, but apparently he was very interested in the music, like literally reading through the music, and that was a big influence on some of the ideas that came to be this piece. And I think it's what's interesting is that the percussion setup is somewhat representative of a drum set, with bass drums, snare drums, cymbals, and things like that, but it's not written idiomatically whatsoever like a drum set. And I think the violin part too, there's some kind of a sense there of like fiddle music, but it's not at all fiddle music. So the way that it was read somewhere that Chopin waltzes are to dance waltzes is what this Stravinsky jazz influenced music would be to jazz dance music, that it's some kind of a personal conceptual idea that is reflected of the music, but is not at all, you can't really say it's jazz. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
I'm going to jump in here for a moment too. I'm not performing tomorrow. The violinist on this piece is
and I read in
who, oh, sorry, did I? I think we had a little glitch there. I was just saying that I'm not performing this piece this time, but I have performed it several times before. Tomorrow it will be
Go ahead.
our wonderful concertmaster, Susanna Perry Gilmore. But and I'm really looking forward to hearing it. It's a fantastic piece and one of my favorites. But Stravinsky also, much of his music is very modern sounding, and he uses a lot of dissonance and techniques that are kind of not heard in music before his time. But in this particular work, he uses a style that a lot of us geeky musicians would refer to as neoclassical, meaning that he really gave a tribute to composers like Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven before him, and emulated their style, but with a very modern slant. So maybe with some very unusual harmonies or some tricky rhythms, but a lot of it is very much kind of a nod, a tip of the hat and a nod back to his predecessors in composition. And that makes this a really accessible piece to listen to. So if anybody out there is kind of uneasy about this idea of these three kind of modern pieces, don't be, because they're all very user-friendly, they're very audience-friendly, and I think you'll find something in them, in all three of them, that you will really enjoy and will be able to kind of grab onto.
Because he did rely on folk music for a lot of the themes in this, right? And so that harks back to other composers, and Stravinsky himself used folk themes in a lot of his music, and in a very, very different setting in the way he approached the music. So it should be great. Derek, you said something in the very beginning of your explanation that brings one of the great things about performing this is that he wrote it in 1918, and as you said, World War I, but it was also the flu pandemic. So we're going back 102 years, 103 years to another pandemic time. And it just seems like a circle almost. I just thought I'd bring that up. I don't have a question that goes along with that. It's just that
Yeah.
It just kind of is an interesting thing. I want, by the way, I was at the concert where the brass were all in the choir loft, and there were two percussionists downstairs, and it was really strange because the horns were up on the left, and their sound came from the right. They played right into the wall, and it came into the audience actually from our right, and it was an amazing effect, and I had no idea how you all were able to pull that piece off, because it wasn't easy to begin with, and then the strange arrangement was unusual.
Yeah. So that was just a situation where we just had to trust our musical instincts and our eyes with the conductor, and then the feedback. And I think we talk about some silver linings, and that would be one of them, is that the different iterations that we're on stage with has allowed us to get to know each other and kind of communicate in a way that is entirely unique, and I think will help us as an orchestra and as an ensemble going forward.
The symphony as a whole in concert, when it's the full symphony and not a chamber setting, is diminished. It's a smaller group than it normally is, because of the distance that you all have to maintain. How has that changed this year? It sounds like an obvious question, but I mean it at a deeper level. What has this year been like to perform in that situation? Anne, I'll start with you, and then Nate, and then
Sure.
Derek. I'll ask all of you.
I think it has been both wonderful and terrible all at the same time. Obviously, there have been so many challenges to performing, not being able to hear well, not being able to see well, not being able to have our full complement of musicians on stage, especially in the strings, were much diminished, and it's very hard to play works by composers like Sibelius or Tchaikovsky, when you have only 6 first violins and 6 second violins, for example. But wonderful in that we are playing, and there are so many orchestras out there even now that are not. I was in another meeting today, symphony related, where somebody brought up the statistic that apparently only 23% of US orchestras are currently back to playing live concerts, and we are one of them. And that's a tribute to our management and to the people who are helping us, be there and perform. So it's the silver lining. It's been tough, but at least we are able to do it. And so I think we're all very grateful for that.
Yeah, I agree with everything Anne said. I would say probably the most challenging from the bass section side of it, I would say is we almost all of our full orchestra, like our Masterworks concerts, have been with 3 bass players, where generally we have 7. We had one piece, I'm struggling to remember which one it was, but it was just strings, and we had a 4th player come in. But so that's been a big challenge, especially Sibelius too is a great example, because we still have a full wind and brass complement and percussion, and so trying to play for what would be twice as many bass players has been a challenge. I would say hearing has definitely been an issue. One kind of silver lining, I don't know how Anne feels about this as a fellow string player, but since we're all on our own stand, in some ways that kind of helps line up sight lines a little better, whereas before you would have your music stand kind of exactly halfway in between you and your stand partner, and now you can kind of just put it exactly where you want it, so you can, especially from where I sit, I kind of get it in line so I can see our principal cellist Paul, and then the conductor and Susanna, and the inner circle kind of all in that straight line. So that is one silver lining of our social distancing.
A lot of us are getting used to having our own stands. We'll see what happens when we go back to having to share.
Right.
Oh, you're going to be spoiled. Derek, what's it meant for you?
Yeah, I think from a personal standpoint, when we were first kind of facing the shutdown, it was challenging to want to practice and to feel like the kinds of things that before were everyday things, in the face of something that is as serious as what this has been, it doesn't feel as important, and it makes it a lot harder to commit the time that we would usually commit to it. But after a period of time, I think what I kind of eventually came around to was the idea that that makes it that much more valuable, that the small things are the things that it can be that important, and the routine and the idea of the quality of my craft and what I try to bring to the orchestra to elevate it that much more, because without it, it was an absence that was definitely felt. So I think initially it was hard to want to be, or hard to feel that what I was doing was important. And eventually that kind of shifted back to feeling like it was extremely important, because it's something that is important to me and to the community, and the idea of live arts and live performance is an essential thing, even though you can't necessarily put a monetary value on it. So it just was interesting to see how that kind of shift happened over the course of it all.
And I agree, Anne. There have been so many people that are involved in this besides the orchestra members on the stage, the people behind the scenes. Maestro Wilkins actually gave a tribute to them in the last concert, and the people at the Holland Performing Arts Center, all of the people behind the scenes who make it possible for the musicians to be safe, and all the people in the front of the house to make sure that the audience is safe. It's just amazing. And if those of you listening have hesitated to go to hear a performance of the Omaha Symphony, I'd urge you to take that step. Everybody is well separated from everybody else. It's every third row is occupied, and even then the people in that row are well separated. The air handling system is completely changed. There is a mask protocol. Everything is done to maintain safety. And it's our symphony, and it's really worth going out to support the musicians. And simply because we have a symphony that is rare these days, in that it is giving regular performances, the musicians, I think, need to be supported. So I urge people to do that. We're coming up to the end. It's almost 6:45, and everybo's hungry for dinner, or has to get off to a rehearsal as well, probably. It's three pieces tomorrow night, 7:30, in the Holland Performing Arts Center. A piece called Octet. There's more to it than that. It's bassoon, horn, and bass with a string quintet. Strum for string quartet, and then a magnificent Stravinsky piece, The Soldier's Tale. I want to thank Ann Nagoski, Nate Olson, Derek Dreyer. Thank you so much for being guests tonight. It's been great having you.
Thank you.
A lot of fun.
Tomorrow night, 7:30, the Omaha Performing Arts Center, Chamber Orchestra. Everybody should go. Listen to your orchestra, support the fine arts in Omaha. My name is Chris Allen. I'm General Manager of KVNO 90.7 Classical FM, and I thank you for joining us tonight.